Hi, Amber. How are you?
I can't hear you. You're on mute.
Oh, my mic's not plugged in.
Okay, it goes. Never mind. I was on mute.
Actually, my microphone wasn't plugged in. So can you hear me now?
It's a bit faint.
How's that? Is that better?
Yeah, it's a bit
Still
louder.
faint?
Yeah.
Really? Is it loud enough?
Yeah.
How's this? Is it getting better?
Yeah, that's better.
Okay. Okay. Good. Good. How was your
Week going?
Pardon, I couldn't hear that part.
I'm sorry. How's your week going?
It's going well.
Now, what other classes are you taking?
Well, Tuesdays and Thursdays are my busiest days. I have bio and writing in the morning.
Wow.
And then this class in the evening.
Wow, late in the day. Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah.
Good. Well, we'll see if anyone else joins us. Well, do you have any questions about this class?
I tried contacting my group for the project and I got no response. So I was just wondering, like, the essay, how it's going to go.
Yeah. Let me see who else is in your group, because I've heard that from a few people who said it's one of the real downsides of doing a group project is you have some people who do work and then others who don't show up. So it's let's see who else is in your group.
It's Seth and Lily.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm sure you'll do fine. Vivian Lee is a very nice person and she'll be happy to talk to you or to the three of you if Seth and Lily get together. So good. What did you find out about her?
I found out about the whole Seaport district, how it was built up and how it was kind of like trashy before.
Yeah.
And like how she made it nice and the water's clean enough to swim now. And then I found like one. She did something in Philadelphia. No, sorry, Pittsburgh.
Right. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
That's good. Very good. Good. I haven't read what you've written yet. So. Okay. So, well, I think I'll just get started, and I'm going to basically talk about why the revolution happened in Boston. I don't know. Have you studied the revolution at all in Boston?
Yeah, I'm from Tewksbury, so
okay.
It's pretty much all we know about.
Really? Okay. Well, we'll see. If you already know this, then I hope it doesn't bore you. So we'll see. So let me see. I actually do have some slides to show.
Professor Allison, did class start late because the webinar was going on that late?
Yes.
Oh,
yes,
sorry. I logged off because I thought we had class.
No, okay. No, that thank you for coming back. No, because I knew people were going to be doing that. And so I was going to be doing that. So here we are. Let me just see if.
Yep.
So anyway, on Tuesday, I think it was, I talked about the siege of Lewisburg, right? Do you remember this? The capture of Lewisburg, the fortress up in Canada and Cape Breton, the Gibraltar of the North Atlantic. Do you remember this?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Okay. And William Shirley, the gentleman at the top, was the governor of Massachusetts, and he orchestrated this. And great moment. And then this is something really strange. In 1747, in the British fleet is in Boston Harbor preparing to sail back to England. And the Commodore in charge, Commodore Knowles, the gentleman at the bottom, realized he didn't have enough men to sail these ships back to England. So he did what any British commander would be entitled to do in any British port, which is send press gangs to merchant ships in the harbor, rounding up able-bodied sailors, and also sending press gangs ashore Well, actually, he gets most of the men he needs off of the ships in the harbor. And this isn't the first time there was a press gang in an American port, and it's something any British military officer was allowed to do. But the next day, something really strange happens, and that is Governor Shirley had an official residence at the Province House. And the Province House, I don't know if you've seen when you've been downtown, Province Court, which runs off of, well, there's a little alleyway that runs between Tremont Street and Province Court. Province Court runs between School Street and Bromfield Street, and there is a set of steps. Have you seen either of you seen the set of steps off of Province Street?
I don't know. I mean, what I'm thinking of is some corner. Is it on the corner?
Not really. This is a set of steps. It's near the corner. And there's a wall. It's next to the Marliov restaurant. And there is a set of steps leading up to this alleyway. And that's all that's left of the Province House. The Province House used to sit across the street. Actually, was demolished in the 1920s. This is it, though. The thing you're seeing is the Province House, which was the official residence of the governors of Massachusetts. And the next day, Governor Shirley is awakened by a large angry mob outside, and they have in their possession a number of British officers. You know, the British sailors had to stay aboard the ship because there was a fear they might desert. British officers could rent rooms in town or stay with friends in town, which is what these guys were doing. And this Boston mob had heard during the night that these press gangs had gone around to ships in the harbor, taking off sailors, and that some of the sailors resisted and actually had been killed by these press gangs. So people were very angry about this, even though it wasn't true that anyone had died in this impressment. And so what these people did was go out, and they knew where these officers were staying. Basically, they got them out of bed and were holding them hostage. And so this crowd with these hostages appears in front of the Province House and demands that the governor have the men released who are held on these ships. And then these townspeople say, we'll release these officers that we've taken captive. Now, this is really an extraordinary thing. You have the governor confronted by an angry mob who's kidnapped these sailors, these officers, because they're angry about 40, 50 men being impressed on these ships out in the harbor. And the mob, it's not just men. There are women in this mob. Some of them, they're the wives, girlfriends, sisters, mothers of the sailors. What would you do if you were Governor Shirley in this circumstance?
The mob?
You're Governor Shirley. You're confronted by a mob that's taken these British officers hostage. What do you do?
Ask them what they would need, right, to release them. Like,
yeah,
right?
they've said what they said. Yeah, okay, that's great. They've said what they need, though. Release the men who are being held on the ships.
Okay. Oh, in order for the British soldiers to be released?
British officers. These are officers in the British Navy.
Okay, officers. Well, who are the people on the ship?
Well, what do you mean the people on the ship?
Oh, wait, so the officers they were the ones taken on the ship?
No, the officers, the military has a hierarchy. There are the enlisted men, and then there are the officers. If you're an officer, it means your family was well off enough to buy you a commission in the Navy. If you are an enlisted man, it means you are there until the Navy is done with you. Being in the British Navy at this time wasn't a good place to be. In fact, being at sea at all. And if you had any choice, you would want to be on a merchant ship. On a merchant ship, you actually get paid. On a warship, you don't get paid very much. You can't get off when the ship reaches port. And if you step out of line, you're going to be punished by being flogged, really flogged quite brutally. So it's a tough place to be. Anyway, being at sea. And one British writer said that the only men who go to sea are those who can't contrive to get themselves into prison, because being at sea was worse than being in prison. He said, because you also have the possibility of drowning. So these guys, these men who had been on these warships in the harbor, took advantage of the fact that there were merchant ships close by to jump off, get onto these merchant ships where they could pass as ordinary sailors. Or some of them had gone ashore and deserted. Now, the Commodore Knowles, doesn't really have time to look to see if he can find the exact men who deserted. So he sends out press gangs to other ships in the harbor and says, just round up 50 men. That's all we need to sail these vessels back to England. And that's what gets people upset, plus the rumor that some of the men who had been taken resisted and were killed by the press gangs, who also were British officers and sailors. So this is the mob now confronting Governor Shirley. And Governor Shirley also has the rank of general in the British military. He's originally from England. He had a lawyer, came to Boston around 1720 and had been appointed governor. And he had overseen the siege of Lewisburg that took Lewisburg from the French and delivered it to the British Empire. And now he has this mob that's angry about men being impressed into the British fleet.
So what would you guys do, girls?
Yes, Kathleen or Amber, what would you do if you were Governor Shirley?
I don't know. I would obey by what they wanted, right?
So tell Commodore Knowles to release the men who are being held in the British fleet. Commodore Knowles, by the way, what?
Is he like a badass or something?
Is who a badass?
Commodore Knowles.
I think both Shirley and Commodore Knowles are badasses. And Knowles, well, the first thing Shirley does, he walks up to two of these officers who had been taken hostage, grabs them, and brings them onto his side of the fence. He can't believe these guys were stupid enough to get taken hostage. So he is kind of a badass. But that doesn't solve the problem. These people really even angrier now because their folks are being held out on these warships and they want them released. And he says he stalls for time. In Massachusetts, you have a form of government where each town has a town meeting that chooses delegates to a general court, a House of Representatives, and then the House of Representatives chooses a council to advise the governor. So the House of Representatives really represents the people in the towns. The council represents the assembly chosen by people in the towns. The governor is chosen by the British king. So Governor Shirley is here to make sure Massachusetts stays in line with the British crown. And here he has a case where Massachusetts is stepping out of line with the British crown and he needs to do something. And so he says, I have to talk to the council about this. It's really a way of stalling for time. So he's going to meet with the governor's council that afternoon and have them talk about what to do about this problem. And so people say, okay.
You're asking us what we're going to do as Governor Shirley?
Yes, as Governor Shirley, what would you do, Kathleen?
I would grab basically martial law, grab every officer and put them each home and put everybody at home and put a curfew.
Well, here's the problem with that, because there are about 14,000 people in town and there are several hundred on these British ships. And I don't think he has the manpower to do that, much as he might want to. And he also knows he could declare martial law now, but then he knows this British fleet is going to be leaving and he's going to be left with 14,000 really angry people. I can see your point. And Kathleen, I think, is kind of a badass here. Commodore Knowles has a similar idea. Why? And he tells the governor, I can just start shelling this place and burn it down, and that'll teach them a lesson. Kathleen, would you go that far and say, why don't we just burn the place down?
That was when I was more radical, probably.
Well, definitely, yeah.
Yeah, I had a phase, like a really bad phase when I was like 16 where I was ridiculously radical. So it was either tear it all down or rebuild it. So if I was at that time, I would have been like Commodore Knowles, the same idea. Well, burn it down. What's going to happen if it's all gone? I'm
kind of glad you weren't in a position of power when you were 16, but I can see
glad
your point.
too.
Yeah, see. So what about you, Amber? Do you have any suggestions for Governor Shirley?
I don't have anything.
Okay. Well, as I said, Shirley stalls for time. He says, I'm going to meet with the council, and the council will figure out what to do. So the council meeting happens at the old State House in the council chamber. I think I can find you a picture of the council chamber. And here it is. So the brick building is the old State House. The council chamber is the room right behind this balcony here. And so that's where Shirley is meeting with the governor's council. And he has posted sentries at the building at this time. There are stairways leading up to the second floor. You would enter these side doors, and so the front door was here. There's a back door here. And then to get upstairs, there are small stairways on either side. He had posted sentries there. He does have some, the town has a number of militia groups. And so he posts some militiamen on these stairs who are able to block the way because they hear this crowd trying to get in, because the crowd wants to come in and talk to the council as well. And fortunately, the militiamen are there. Fortunately, if you're Governor Shirley, not fortunately, if you're a member of the mob. And they're able to keep this crowd downstairs, but they do hear the windows breaking as this big crowd is trying to get in. And up here in the council chamber, the council is saying, hey, this is a big problem, Governor. We're not really sure what to do about it. And Commodore Knowles is saying, what I can do is start shelling and burn this place down. And Shirley knows, despite what Commodore Knowles and Kathleen are telling him, that's probably not going to be a good idea. Because if the town is burned down, the ships are going to leave, and he's going to be left with now 14,000 really, really angry people. So Shirley suggests maybe, this, by the way, the whole episode goes on for about 2 weeks as the crowd is demanding the release of these men held on the ships, and Shirley is trying to get Knowles to release them, and finally, reluctantly, Knowles does. But before that happens, all kinds of other things happen. Someone finds a small boat that was they thought it was from one of the British ships, and they haul it to the front of the province house to try to set it on fire, to show Shirley they're really upset. And it takes them a while to get this thing to burn. Shirley notices it's not a British boat at all. It belongs to some merchant. They haul it to the commons, set it on fire. You have things like this happening over the course of these 2 weeks, during which Shirley is negotiating with Knowles to get these sailors released, which Knowles ultimately does. And then the fleet leaves town, and Shirley knows Knowles is going to go back to England and tell them how bad everyone in Boston is, and they'll probably impose martial law. So he writes a series of letters to the Lords of Trade, which is the body in London that oversees colonial affairs. Because what he doesn't want, well, I'll ask you, what do you think Shirley doesn't want to happen once word gets back to London about this big problem he's had with the British fleet and with a riot and Commodore Knowles not able to impress sailors? Kathleen, what would you do if you're, say, the king and you hear that Governor Shirley couldn't enforce the law in Boston?
I would, if I was a king and being a king at a time, I would remove Governor Shirley, send multiple British fleets of ships of men who were enlisted, and then probably try to find the inciters and behead them publicly.
Wow, you really are a badass. Okay. What about you, Amber? Would you have a different solution to this problem?
Kind of like the same thing, like just send someone different over there to keep everything in charge.
Okay, okay, Sonid, would you have a different solution?
I think I would go with what Kathleen's saying. Like, they're gonna send, it's in Britain, you said, right?
Yeah,
they're gonna send their people down.
Yeah, well, Shirley he's a very good politician, and he explains what happened, and he says the big problem here is this: there's this democratic constitution here that gives people here too much power. And we really need to change that. We really need to take power away from people. That is, he is not the problem. Instead, it's the system of government they have where every man thinks he runs things. And he says, really, something needs to be done about this or you're headed for big trouble. And Shirley is able to deflect the blame for this from himself to the system here, because people in Boston and people in Massachusetts have more power over their own affairs than anyone else in the British Empire. And Shirley says, this is a big problem. So the problem isn't Shirley. Any governor you send is going to have the same problem because people here have this exaggerated sense of their own power and their own importance. And so Shirley keeps his job. And Commodore Knowles, by the way, doesn't get to England before Shirley's letter does, which is another fortunate thing. He, as I said, he had to impress these sailors because he didn't have enough to get the vessels across the Atlantic. So in order to sail across the Atlantic, he has to find more sailors. And he knows he can't find them in Boston. So he sails to New York, where he impresses sailors, and there's no problem there. What Knowles and the British fleet learn is that you cannot impress sailors in Boston. And this is the last time they try it because they realize they can't do it, because there is something about the community here in Massachusetts that doesn't want their sailors impressed. And this is something you see, it's a persistent thing in the letters of Shirley and the governors who succeed him after this episode in the late 1740s. It's another thing that happens. Let me just see if I can find this while we're on this subject. Okay. By the way, after the war, after the siege of Lewisburg, Shirley had been offered a knighthood because he was such a great, I mean, this is the problem with firing him, the way Kathleen said. He had become something of a hero for capturing Lewisburg, and he's offered a knighthood, but he declined the knighthood and instead says he would take the cash value. And he uses that cash value to buy land in Roxbury and build a house. And his house is still there, the Shirley Eustace house in Roxbury. You can see this picture from, it shows what it would have looked like kind of on the shore of the South Bay. And here is the town of Boston off in the distance. And Governor Shirley built one of the most elegant houses in America from the proceeds from, well, what would have been a knighthood. So Shirley does okay in the end, despite that, unpleasantness in 1647. Now, at the same time, Shirley is involved in building a new King's Chapel. I talked last time about the growing Episcopal or Anglican presence here, and King's Chapel is rebuilt in the between the late 1740s and early 1750s. The same architect who designed King's Chapel designed Shirley's house in Roxbury. And, we talked a little bit about this building that's made of granite. They actually built it around the old wooden building and then dismantled the wooden building and passed the wood out the windows. So this is really showing that it's okay to be an Anglican here in Boston. And despite not wanting our men impressed, we're kind of happy being part of the British Empire. However, in about 1751, the Anglican Church, I don't know how much you know about the Anglican Church. Does anyone know anything about the Anglican Church, the Church of England?
Nope.
No.
Okay, so the Church of England, the only difference between the Church of England and the Roman Catholic Church is the Church of England doesn't acknowledge the Pope as the head of the church. Instead, the king is the head of the church, and the king appoints the bishops, but the bishops all have to, we don't need to get into theology here. The Catholic Church has saints. The Puritans don't like the idea of saints because saints aren't mentioned in the Bible, and saints, if you're a Catholic, are intercede with you, between you and God. And the Puritans say there really are no such thing. We all are saints. We all should be visible saints and not simply have figures who are considered to be saints. But the Anglicans do have saints. Does anyone know how you get to be a saint if this is your aim? I mean, in this period, there are more recent saints. I don't know if any of you have thought about sainthood.
Don't you get declared saint by the Pope?
Yeah, the Pope does have to declare you a saint. There's a process to it. And there also have to be miracles attributed to you. And most saints got to be saints by being martyred, that is, dying for their faith. Okay, so that's one step. You don't necessarily have to do that, since the recent Pope John Paul II and Mother Teresa have been declared saints, even though they were not martyred. So, however, in the Anglican Church, very similar rules for sainthood. And one of the saints in the Anglican Church was this man. Does anyone know who this is? He is someone that the Anglican Church considered died for the faith. He was King Charles I. And King Charles I had been beheaded back in about 1651, which means in 1751, we're approaching the centennial of his martyrdom. Do you remember who it was that executed Charles I? I don't mean personally, but what group was responsible for his execution?
Is it the
Sure.
Anglicans?
No, he is an Anglican.
Oh, he is himself.
Yes.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I didn't hear that part.
Okay, no, that's okay. Well, think back to the 1640s, 1650s, when there's an English Civil War going on. Charles I is on one side. Who's on the other side? It's a group we've talked a lot about in the context of Boston history. Excuse me? What, Amber?
France?
Not France. No.
You say it's a group of people, Puritans?
Yeah. Who's Santa?
I don't know if they're like Puritans. I don't know.
Yes, they are Puritans.
Okay,
Exactly.
Awesome.
So the Puritans in England had overthrown Charles I and executed him. And these, of course, are the same Puritans who are here in Boston, and they didn't believe in the Anglican Church or in the power of kings. And so they were pretty happy with Charles I's execution. And now 100 years have gone by, and there are still a lot of Puritans and their descendants here in Boston, still kind of unhappy with the monarchy, which came back, although now there are more Anglicans here, and it's okay to be an Anglican in Boston, but there's still a kind of uncertainty about whether we really like having Anglicans around. And now in 1751, when we have this growing Anglican presence here, there is a rumor that spreads through town that there are 3 Anglican churches in Boston. There are a lot more congregational churches in Boston, and a rumor spreads among the Congregationalists that in January of 1751, the Anglicans are going to commemorate the death of Charles I, who is a saint in the Anglican Church. By the way, do you know when typically, what is the date on which you typically commemorate a saint? What is usually the anniversary of? A Saint's Day. I don't know if any of you.
Oh, St. Patrick's Day.
St. Patrick's Day. Okay, St. Patrick's Day. And what is St. Patrick's Day the anniversary of?
Something with Ireland.
Well, it's something to do with St. Patrick, who's the
Is he
patron saint.
Oh, St. Patrick. Oh.
Yes.
Is St. Patrick Irish? Is that why?
Well, yes, but what's the significance of March 17th for the life of St. Patrick? and the sainthood of St. Patrick.
Was he canonized?
Well, he was, but not on March 17th, something else.
He died?
He died, yes, that's it. It's usually the anniversary of your martyrdom is your saint's day. St. Valentine, February 14th, St. Patrick, March 17th. Other saints we could talk about. Right now we're talking about Charles I, and his saint's day was January 31st. And so the rumor spreads that on January 31st, we're going to be commemorating the sainthood of Charles I. This really is upsetting to the Congregationalists in Boston. Why would it be upsetting to the Congregationalists of Boston?
Because they don't like Charles.
They don't like Charles. How did they show their dislike of Charles?
They killed him.
They killed him, exactly. Yeah, they cut off his head. And now the Anglicans are saying we're going to commemorate him because he's a saint. You can imagine this is going to be a little upsetting to the Congregationalists in town, who are the descendants of the Puritans. And one of them, my screen has frozen, a congregational minister named Jonathan Mayhew he gives a series of sermons. That is, every Sunday, his sermon is about Charles I. And it's a discourse. It's not just about why Charles I was a bad guy and shouldn't be a saint. It's really about why you should not have kings. He's really not a martyr. He wasn't a good king. He was a bad man. And the big question is, who gets to decide whether or not a king is a good king? Which is a pretty good question. And what do you do with a bad king? So Jonathan Mayhew has this series of sermons about Charles I saying, bad man, bad king, and we know he's a bad king because the people judged him. That is, it is up to people, the governed, to judge those in power over them. This is, the very important series of sermons that Mayhew delivers in 1751, and the Anglicans in Boston, if they were planning to commemorate Charles I, think better of it. And here the doctrine that Mayhew is saying is that people can judge those in power over them. Very important idea. So here in Boston, you have a couple of things that are unique among colonial towns. One, you have leaders like Mayhew, who are saying it is really up to the people to judge those in power. And two, you have people like this mob who are ready to seize British officers to prevent their brothers, husbands, lovers from being impressed into the British fleet, thinking they have this power. Governor Shirley sees this as a problem. He suggests that the British government reform it. The British government never does. But you have in Boston really the seeds for this resistance to authority, which the people don't accept. Any questions on this?
Oh, it's interesting.
Well, I think so. Now, you can see the possibilities here with this sense that we really govern ourselves, because people here with their town meetings do have more power over their own affairs than anyone else in the British Empire. And what happens in these years, really between 1750 and 1770, you have two things. One, you have this sense here that we govern ourselves. We sit in judgment on those who are in power over us. On the other hand, you have a British Empire that is trying to assert more power over different parts of the empire, over the colonies. And this new government had been set up in the 1690s, where the monarch appoints the governor, and then you have an assembly representing the towns. And as long as the interest of the towns and the interest of the empire were the same, everyone got along. But what we see happening in the 1750s and 1760s was the interest starting to diverge. That is, the British Empire is now trying to regulate trade and trying to make sure that the benefits of trade accrue to the empire. And so they don't start taxing things. They always had taxes on goods imported into the colonies, but it never bothered to send anyone over to collect the taxes. And between the mid 1750s and early 1760s, there's a huge war between the British and the French empires, which the British Empire wins. And the war leaves the British Empire really heavily in debt. More importantly, the British Empire now realizes it's an empire, and Parliament starts trying to govern this empire by taxing goods that are going to these various colonies and requiring that goods go in British ships and so on. So you have Parliament trying to legislate for the empire, and people in Massachusetts saying, Parliament doesn't govern us. And this does lead to a collision between Parliament and the towns of Massachusetts, really led by Boston. Let's see. Here's one in 1761. This is kind of an innocuous case. There's a guy bringing in a cargo of sugar into Boston. And the customs collector, a guy named Lechmere, wants to be able to inspect the cargo. And he goes to the solicitor, that is the lawyer for the province. This is like the attorney general today, a Boston lawyer whose job is to represent the crown in proceedings in court. And so Mr. Lechmere goes to James Otis, the solicitor for the province, and says, I'd like a writ of assistance, which okay, let me ask this. Suppose that Sana is a customs collector, and suppose that Amber has a ship, and Sana wants to go aboard your ship to inspect your cargo, Amber. Are you going to let her?
Wait, can you repeat that again? Sorry.
So you have a ship. You've just brought it into Boston, and it's filled with all kinds of things that you're supposed to pay taxes on, but you don't want to pay taxes. The official here who is supposed to inspect your ship is Sana. And so she shows up at the dock and says, I want to come aboard your ship. What do you say?
No.
And Sana, what do you do then?
Go ahead and go on her ship.
But she has all these sailors. You're probably going to throw you off the ship. Or let's suppose Amber's gotten all of her stuff into a warehouse on the dock. And then you go to the warehouse and you say, let me in. I want to inspect it. Amber, are you going to let her in?
No.
So what are you going to do now? What are you going to do now, Sana?
Well, what if I didn't go approach her and just went and broke into her warehouse?
Well, she might go to Mr. Otis and say, hey, there's someone breaking into my warehouse. Then you could be arrested for breaking and entering. If you have a writ of assistance, that's a legal power to go in. And also that writ of assistance, you could get other people to go and help you. I mean, it empowers you to get other help. So you could get Kathleen, you could get any number of other people to go down and force your way in then legally. But if you just break in, that's against the law. And so Lechmere knows this. He's not going to break in. He goes to Otis and says, can you get me a writ of assistance? And James Otis says, no, I'm not going to get you a writ of assistance. Furthermore, I'm going to resign as solicitor, and I'm going to go to court and argue that a writ of assistance is a violation of the British common law and the British Constitution. And this is an admiralty court that meets in Boston. And these are judges who are, this is where you would go to get a writ. You have to go to a judge for it. And so Otis has a 5-hour argument before these judges saying why writs of assistance violate the fundamental right that someone has to be secure in his person and property. You know, there's an old British saying, a common law tradition, that no matter how humble a man's cottage, The wind may enter, the storm may enter, but the King of England may not enter without that man's permission. And Lechmere, an agent of the king, according to the British common law, can't enter a cottage or a warehouse or a ship without that man's permission unless he has a writ of assistance. But Otis argues that the writ of assistance violates this very idea, because it doesn't really say what it is what it is Lechmere is looking for. So imagine that, let's suppose Sana and Amber had a grudge against each other, and suddenly one of you gets a writ to go and look around in the other one's stuff. This is what Otis warns about. The writ doesn't specify where someone can look or what the person is looking for. It just says Lechmere is allowed to go look in this person's warehouse for whatever he might find. So the court, by the way, doesn't buy this argument, but other people in Boston do. And in fact, this is the argument you see 30 years later in the Fourth Amendment to the Constitution. The reason it is there is because of this argument that Otis advanced in 1761. John Adams later said that then and there, when Otis made this argument, the child independence was born. And so you have this resistance here in Boston to this idea of a customs official being able to inspect a cargo or go into a warehouse or a shop. And you also have this idea that people can sit in judgment in those in power over them. So this is what's happening here in Boston as the British government is trying to increase its authority and make sense of this empire. Any questions on this so far? Okay, well, let's see. Mr. Lechmere, well, in the British government taxes molasses, sugar, and then it taxes paper goods. And in Boston, both of these things lead to, well, I began by talking about the riot over impressment. There are more riots over sugar and stamps. Let me see if I can, here's another thing that's, as I mentioned, Boston was very Protestant. Well, we don't need to talk about all of these riots and things. I know you're interested in other things. Just here's what happens. In 1765, Parliament passes this Stamp Act that puts a tax on all kinds of paper goods, newspapers, playing cards, dice, etc. And it essentially taxes everyone. And people in Boston say, we don't have to pay these taxes. That is, we are not taxed by Parliament. Big argument about that. The taxes are the stamps go on sale on November 1st of 1765. That's the day this law is supposed to take effect, which means that, we have to get the apparatus in place to establish this tax. You have to have someone who is going to sell these stamps. And the person who is chosen to sell the stamps is this guy, Andrew Oliver. Now, Mr. Oliver is a merchant in town. This is his brother, Peter Oliver. And they're from a family of merchants. And Andrew Oliver, in addition to being a merchant, is he's actually appointed to be a tax agent to sell the stamps. This is a close family friend, Thomas Hutchinson. These personalities are kind of important because without them, if different people were involved in this, you might have seen a different outcome. And the Hutchinsons and the Olivers are very close. Thomas Hutchinson's wife, Mary, was the sister of Peter Oliver's wife, Peggy. And Andrew Oliver married the third sister of this family. So the Olivers and the Hutchinsons were married to sisters. And it gets even more interesting because Andrew Oliver's daughter marries Thomas Hutchinson's son. And Andrew Oliver's other daughter marries Thomas Hutchinson's other son. And then Peter Oliver's granddaughter marries, or Peter Oliver's grandson marries Thomas Hutchinson's daughter. So you see, it's a close family connection here. This isn't just to give idle gossip. The Hutchinsons and the Olivers were very close. And Hutchinson is the lieutenant governor. Andrew Oliver is the tax collector. And we know the stamps are going to go on sale on November the 1st. Any questions on this so far? Okay. On August 14th, a rumor spreads through town that the stamps have arrived and they're at Peter Oliver's warehouse on Long Wharf. And that night, it's the night of August the 14th of 1765, a mob descends on Long Wharf and they tear down Oliver's warehouse. It's a 2-story brick building. They tear it down using their bare hands and axes and crowbars and throw the rubble into the harbor. They don't actually have any, there's no stamps inside, but there's a rumor that there are stamps inside. And then they invite Mr. Oliver to come to a gathering at a big tree where they like to gather on Boston Neck. I'll show you, here's the tree. Yeah, this tree. By the way, this tree is right at Boston Neck. It's at the entrance to Boston. I'll see if I can show you where exactly that is. It's right about here. So it's everyone coming into town has to pass by this tree. If you're coming in from Roxbury, and it's a great place to hang placards and banners and things. And it's right outside a tavern, another good gathering place. And today, this is roughly the corner of Essex Street and Washington Street. And this big tree gathering spot, and they invite Mr. Oliver, his warehouse was here on Long Wharf, to come down to the tree the next day. And he gets there, and there is an effigy of himself hanging from the tree with a noose around the neck, holding a sign saying "Death to the Stamp Tax." And they ask Mr. Oliver if he wants to resign as tax agent. What would you say if you were Mr. Oliver? I mean, these hooligans had torn down your warehouse, and now they're hanging your effigy on the tree. What would you do, Amber, if you now were called to the tree and Oliver, your effigy is hanging there with a noose around its neck?
I would think they're crazy.
You would think they're crazy, yes. Would you resign your job?
No.
No? What would you do, Sana?
I don't know, retaliate.
How would you retaliate?
I don't know, maybe get some people.
Get some people. Well, that might be a good thing. I mean, you're one person right now, and there are several hundred and they've torn down your warehouse. Yeah, it could be they're crazy, but they seem to have a lot of power.
Yeah, but I want to do it like right away.
Oh yeah.
Right.
Kathleen, what would you do? How much of a badass are you?
I'm unsure.
Yeah.
Well,
he does resign.
Situation, like you have to be there to figure out a situation. Like,
no, I guess you're right. You do have to be there to figure out. He does resign as tax agent. Okay, sorry I ever thought of it. Now, it's probably a wise move on his part, although his brother-in-law Thomas Hutchinson doesn't think so. Hutchinson thinks, wait a minute, if we can't enforce the law because a mob doesn't like it, what kind of law do we have? And he suggests that, maybe his brother-in-law should have been a little tougher and not simply caved in to the mob. And he might be right. On the other hand, some of the leaders in town on the other side are saying, look, Hutchinson thinks Oliver shouldn't have resigned. Plus, there was a rumor that Thomas Hutchinson really was behind the Stamp Act. He had written to people in England saying, hey, we should tax these people. And so a week and a half after the demolition of Oliver's warehouse, Hutchinson is at his home in the North End having dinner. His wife has died. He's there home with his daughter having dinner. And suddenly they hear the mob outside. And his daughter says, maybe we should leave. And, you know, Thomas Hutchinson is from here. He is a Bostonian. He went to the Latin school. He went to Harvard. The family's been here since the 1630s. What does he have to be afraid of? And then they hear an axe hitting the front door. They hear the windows smashing as this mob ransacks the house. This is a picture of the mob ransacking Hutchinson's house. They cut he and his daughter flee through the back door. They cut the eyes out of his portrait, and things really get going when they find his wine cellar and help themselves to that. So this is this same mob here attacking Hutchinson's house. And so you have these violent protests in Boston against the Stamp Act. And in Parliament, there's a debate about, is the stamp tax a good thing or not? It's not actually bringing in any revenue. It's causing this chaos everywhere they try to enforce it. This is the Chancellor of the Exchequer. This is the guy in charge of money in the British Empire, Charles Townshend. And this is his secretary, Thomas Whately. And in Parliament, one member of Parliament says, why are we going to give in, as there's a push, maybe we should repeal the act. What would you guys do? Would you repeal the act because it's causing so much trouble, or do you want to show you can enforce the law?
Maybe repeal the act.
Okay.
Well, I don't know.
Okay. Well,
Because
I'm not saying
if they enforce it, it's going to get worse, right?
it could, yeah, unless, I mean, you're really going to have to get tough if you want to enforce it. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm not saying you're wrong to want to enforce the law. Kathleen or Amber, you have any thoughts on this? What you would do if you were in Parliament?
I feel like if they like stop it, then they're gonna think they can get away with anything they enforce on them. But
That's
if they
very
keep
true.
doing it, then they're just gonna do even more.
Yeah, it would really empower these folks. And you know, someone says, why are we going to give in to these lawless hooligans? After all, this guy says, these colonies have been planted by our tender care and nurtured by our governance and supported and protected by our strong arm. And why are we now going to give in to a lawless mob? And this is another member of Parliament who I guess would more agree with Sana. This is Isaac Barry, and Barry says, planted by your tender care, they left to get away from you. Nurtured by your tender governance, they've thrived despite your every attempt to stifle them. Protected by your strong arm, they've borne arms in your defense. And then he says, they're really not lawless mobs. He said, it is your policies that caused the blood of these freeborn sons of liberty to rise within them. This is a great line, sons of liberty. And the guy who's been the leader of the Boston mob is a shoemaker named Ebenezer McIntosh. And he realizes, for years, I've been the leader of this mob. How about if we change the mob and call it the Sons of Liberty? And that's what happens. And the tree where they gather becomes the Liberty Tree. And so here you can see a commemoration of the Liberty Tree, which you can see on the corner of Essex and Washington Street. It's been there since 1850 when this building was built over where this tree used to stand. So this becomes a symbol of this resistance. And then Parliament does repeal the Stamp Act in early 1766. And that, of course, convinces the Sons of Liberty that when they protest like this, Parliament will back down. So they kind of know that they have this power. As Amber had said, it's going to embolden them to think they can do more things. But right now, Parliament realized, hey, we're not raising any revenue with the stamp tax, so we might as well give it up. But then things don't go well for the empire. By the way, I'm sorry, it's not a very good image. This is what happened. In 1767, Parliament passes a new series of tax laws. And the governor at this time, Governor Bernard, says, if I'm going to enforce the law, I'm going to need military force, because this is really a lawless place. And so 2 regiments of British troops arrive in Boston in October of 1768. And this is Paul Revere's engraving of the arrival of the British troops at Long Wharf. And this is Long Wharf. And these are the British ships. They're not tying up because they know how dangerous it would be if they tied the ships up next to the dock. They remembered what had happened back in 1748 and in 1765. But you can see there are a number of things that really, one thing you notice if you look at the engraving is this gap here between these 2 buildings. What do you think that represents? If I had a clearer engraving, you would see it looks like a missing tooth.
I don't know. I'm driving, but I'm trying to look.
Okay, good. Well, yeah, don't look at this while you're driving, Sana.
What is it? Is it like a bridge?
No, it's a gap.
Oh.
There's a building here. There's a building here. There's no building here.
Why is there not a building there?
That's where Peter Oliver's warehouse had been, and that got torn down.
Oh, okay.
And the other thing you might notice if you looked, by the way, Amber or Kathleen, do you notice anything? What kind of a town is this?
It's a port town.
Yeah, it is a port town. That's very good. What are all these buildings?
Those are churches.
Those are churches. Do you really need the protection of British troops when there are this many churches in town? That really seems to be one thing Revere might be saying here. We don't need troops because this is really a law-abiding place. And that's what Boston told itself. We're a law-abiding place. We don't need the troops. And then the other thing that happens here is these troops arrive, about 2,000 troops. There are about 12,000 people in town. So it's 1 soldier for every 6 people, and which is a big number of soldiers. And here is the other problem. When troops are sent to a town to protect it, it's the town's responsibility to house them. But when Bernard says to the town of Boston, you need to find a place to house these troops, the town says, no, we don't, because we don't need protection from the troops. You ask for them, you find a place to put them. And so Bernard really has a problem. The troops camp on Boston Common, but this is October. And if they're going to be here through the winter, it's going to be really tough to have them sleeping out on the Common. So he has to find another place to house these troops, which you can imagine is not an easy problem to solve. And the town says it's not up to us. The provincial government, that is the government of Massachusetts, says it's not up to us. So Bernard has to find a place to house the troops. And he thinks he has a good solution in a building called the Manufactory House. And the Manufactory House stood where Sergeant Hall now stands. So it's the building where our class usually meets, is where this happened. And the Manufactory House was kind of a poorhouse. You know, there was a poorhouse in Boston, an almshouse just off Boston Common. And the Manufactory House had been built back in the 1740s. And the idea was you'll have a building where poor people can go and they'll learn how to weave. They'll have looms set up and they'll learn how to weave. They won't be poor and they won't have to be in the almshouse anymore. So it's kind of a workhouse. It doesn't really work. I mean, the idea of this is a place where poor people can learn how to weave doesn't really work out. So by the 1760s, it's still a place where there are poor people living. They're renting rooms. There are some looms set up in the basement that these poor folks can use. But these aren't people who have any real power in the town. And Governor Bernard thinks no one in the town really cares about these folks. So we can evict them from the manufactory house and house the soldiers there. So he sends the sheriff down to the manufactory house. The sheriff is a man named Stephen Greenleaf, and he goes and knocks on the door of the house, and he tells the tenant who opens the door that clear out, the soldiers are going to come in. And this tenant, a man named Green, what do you think he does? What would you do if you were Elisha Green and the sheriff shows up and says, clear out, the soldiers are going to be staying here?
I think he has much of a choice. Does he have anything to say?
Well, that's, yeah, you would think he doesn't have much of a choice. Kathleen or Amber, you have any idea what he might say?
Not without an order. Like, kind of like that. I don't know.
You see, somebody tells him to go away, closes the door. So what do you do if you're the sheriff? I know,
Ladies?
Kathleen, what? Say
Okay,
please?
like
Yeah, okay.
No, I mean, doesn't he need something kind of like to get like to allow that, right?
Well, he doesn't seem,
Like
under British law, these soldiers have to be housed by the town. And these are people that really aren't in a position to object, the sheriff thinks. But now Mr. Green's closed the door on them. So he does go back to the governor and says, what do I do now? And the governor says, well, why don't you take some soldiers down? And maybe the sight of the soldiers will change this guy's mind. Doesn't really work. And the governor knows that there are people in the town saying the soldiers are sent here to invade our space and to do all kinds of things. So the governor doesn't want to have the soldiers break down the door and oust these people because he knows that would look really bad. So he thinks maybe we can starve them out. So the soldiers form a ring around the house to prevent anyone from going in or coming out. Remember, there's no food inside the house. They don't have refrigeration. There's no running water. So he doesn't think these people are going to be able to hold out for very long with this siege of the manufactory house. But then townspeople come and they form a ring around the soldiers, and over the heads of the soldiers, they throw things like loaves of bread and hams and things to feed the people inside. Remember, the people inside are poor people. They can't vote in town meeting, but the town comes to their defense. And then the sheriff realizes someone inside the house tries to climb out through one of the basement windows. And the sheriff thinks, well, if they can get in and out of the house that way, maybe we can go into the basement and take the house from inside. So the sheriff and some soldiers climb into the basement, and the people inside the house lock them up. So you have the soldiers holding the townhouse hostage, the people inside the manufactory house hostage. You have the people inside the manufactory house holding the soldiers, some soldiers and the sheriff hostage. And after about 2 weeks, the governor calls off the siege and says, okay, we're not going to try to take the house. Instead, we'll house the soldiers. I'll actually pay for rooms around town for them. And this ends the siege of the manufactory house, which is the first conflict between American civilians and British soldiers. And it's a nonviolent conflict. And who won?
I would assume the soldiers.
Why would you say the soldiers?
Because you said it was a non-violent thing, right?
It's nonviolent, yes.
Yeah, so they didn't, like, there was like no violence, and I don't know. So that's what I'm leaning towards. Because if there was like violence, I don't know.
So the soldiers were trying to take possession of the manufactory house.
Yeah.
Did the soldiers get possession of the manufactory house?
Well, then again, if there was, maybe not if there was no violence. I don't know.
Well, it doesn't, I mean, there's still going to be a victor if there's violence or not. But Amber, who won the siege of the manufactory house?
The people in the house, because they end up keeping it, and the soldiers had to find somewhere else to stay, or they paid for them to stay somewhere else.
Yeah, the soldiers don't get the house, which is what they were trying to get. So again, this gets back to what you were saying earlier about this giving people power. And so the soldiers do. There's a lot of empty space because a lot of the sugar warehouses around Brattle Square, roughly where the government center T station is now, were vacant because business was down. So that becomes a barracks. There are other barracks around town. Meanwhile, the reason the soldiers are here is because of these tax laws. Now, back in 1765, Parliament had passed a tax law. People here protested, and in 1766, Parliament repealed the tax laws. Now you have the soldiers in town, and you have these tax laws. We have this nonviolent protest, but the most important thing we're doing in 1767, 68, 69 about these taxes is boycotting things. We're not having the kind of violent riots you saw in 1765 over this, but people signed an agreement. We're not going to buy any of these goods that are taxed. And the goods that are taxed are lead, paint, glass, and tea. And the soldiers are here, and there's really not much for the soldiers to do because there aren't any riots and there's not any trouble. So the soldiers are basically just hanging around, and some of them find part-time jobs and fit into the community, and others don't. It's kind of a difficult time because you have these, let me see if I have some more pictures to show you of this. Okay, so you have this period where the soldiers are here, we're boycotting stuff, but Parliament's not backing down. There's no sign that Parliament is going to change the law and start letting, not tax us. So I don't know if any of you have ever participated in a boycott. Have any of you? No. Boycotts are very hard to organize and to keep going. And here for almost 3 years, you've not been buying this stuff. Glass you need if your windows break. Lead you also need if your windows break. Paint you need if you want to paint your house. But we've all agreed we're not going to buy these things. And the point is we won't buy them. And this will pressure British merchants who want to sell them to tell Parliament to back off. But that doesn't happen. And so what happens by early 1769, 1770, people start saying, the boycott doesn't work. Why are we doing this? And one guy who had signed the agreement saying, I'm not going to buy or sell any British goods. By the way, there are about 600 people who signed this agreement in 1767, and about 200 plus of them are women who are shopkeepers in Boston. They've all agreed we're not going to buy or sell this stuff. But now, why are we doing this? And one fellow who had signed the agreement in 1769, he says, well, why are we still doing this? It's not working. That's one thing. Secondly, I know what gives Parliament power to govern the empire because it governs the empire and it's part of the whole British system. But I don't know who these Sons of Liberty are who have said we can't buy things, or who the Committee of Safety is who said no one should buy or sell any of these goods. And he also says, is it better to be governed by one tyrant 3,000 miles away or by 3,000 tyrants close to home? And this whole question of who decides who gets to buy and sell things, isn't that an infringement on my liberty and the liberty of other people who might want to buy something? Is it? Do you think this guy's name, by the way, is Theophilus Lilly? Does he have a point that his liberty is being infringed upon by the Sons of Liberty?
Yeah.
You said yes, then you said no.
Yeah, I mean, I would think, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I would think so too. By the way, if you are the Sons of Liberty, if you're any group making an argument, the last thing you want is someone who can turn your argument against you the way this guy is doing. So he becomes something of a target. And then in February of 1770, he announces that he has some goods he's going to put on sale the following Thursday, the 22nd of February of 1770, which Thursdays at this time was a day off for all the schoolboys in Boston. And he announces that at his shop, he will have on sale some goods from London. And so that day, someone puts a big sign out of his shop with a hand pointing to it saying, here is an importer, which is a bad thing. And the schoolboys in Boston, that is, teenagers and preteens, gather and they smear the front of his shop with what was called Liberty Paint, which is essentially cattle and pig dung from the street. And anyone going into the shop is going to get pelted with this stuff. I don't know if you're going to want to go into the shop if you're going to get pelted with the pig dung and the cow dung. And they are taunting him and throwing things through the windows. And he has a friend named Ebenezer Richardson who comes to his assistance with his gun loaded with swan shot that he brandishes out the window. And meanwhile, the windows are broken. Lily and his daughters are cowering upstairs, and they hear kids coming over the back fence. And on the other side of the street are members of the Sons of Liberty encouraging these kids. Sometimes young kids sometimes have less restraint than adults, and the adults know this. And as this crowd is really, a crowd of kids is really, encroaching on the house, breaking the windows and so on, Richardson fires his gun out the window and hits a 12-year-old boy named Christopher Seiter, who's bending over to pick up a rock to throw through the window. And Seiter falls to the ground, and someone does grab Richardson, hauls him out, and they want to hang him. And one of the Sons of Liberty says, let's not hang him. We can put him on trial and then hang him legally. Now, having Christopher Seiter die does calm down the mob for a moment because they captured this guy. And of course, people do stop what they were doing. And then Samuel Adams organizes a funeral for Christopher Seiter. At this time, as of today, if a person dies, it's that person's family's responsibility to bury him. And Christopher Seiter is a kid who doesn't, his parents are Germans in what is still called Germantown in Quincy. He's an apprentice. It's unclear how his name was spelled. So he is really the definition of a nobody. But his funeral is conducted by the town of Boston. His body lies in state in Faneuil Hall. And several days after his death, his body is carried out of Faneuil Hall by 200 Boston schoolboys. And his casket is followed by 2,000 people. Now, Boston's whole population is about 12,000. So 1 out of every 6 people in Boston follows Christopher Seiter's casket. This is someone whose name we're not even sure how it is spelled. And let's see, I'll show you the procession of Christopher Seiter's funeral, which up till this time was the largest funeral ever held in North America. So it goes from Faneuil Hall down through through King Street, down here, goes around the Liberty Tree, and up here to the Granary burying ground. Church bells tolling, this body carried, this martyred innocents. So this is the state of things in early 1770. You have this tension between the enforcers of the law, in this case, the sheriff, the troops, and people like Ebenezer Richardson and Theophilus Lilly, and the Sons of Liberty and these other groups about who is in charge here. And Christopher Seiter's funeral is really a marker of who is in charge here. It seems to be the Sons of Liberty. And what will happen next is a big question. Now, I think, happy as I would be to continue talking about this, I know you have lives to get back to, and we'll carry this on. If not the next time we meet, then after that, next Tuesday, we have someone from the Boston Public Library who will be talking more about their resources. And that's it for tonight. Any questions?
Nope, I made it to Rhode Island. Are we going to talk about Rhode Island anytime?
Well, we might, yeah. I'm glad you made it, and drive safely.
Thank you, Professor Allison.
Okay.
I'll see you next week. Bye.
Take care, Sana.
Bye.
Take care, Kathleen. Take care, Amber. Good to see you.
Thank you.
Bye.